The Uber contentious debate. Are ride-hailing apps fair play or unregulated and underhand? Also on today's program, a violation of human rights or legal and constitutional? Is Australia's asylum strategy fair? And in Picture This, Haiti hits a political deadlock as protesters take to the streets of Port-au-Prince. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. The world of business is changing and it seems technology is the driving cause. But are apps like Uber, Airbnb and Alibaba destroying traditional industry, or are they a sign of an evolving economy, of industries simply becoming more efficient? Their popularity has soared over the last 5 years. No business has grown as fast in such a short space of time since the rise of the first car companies at the beginning of the 20th century. Some argue the apps improve consumers' lives. Others say they have the power to destroy lives. But of all the technologies, it's the great Uber debate that has perhaps stirred the most controversy. And that's why today's newsmaker is the car-hailing app itself, Uber, as we ask why the company is one of the world's most loved and hated. We live in a world of greater efficiency, where manufacturing is in decline, and companies that connect buyers and sellers make billions of dollars. Alibaba, the world's most valuable retailer, carries no inventory. Airbnb, the world's largest accommodation provider, owns no real estate. And Uber, the world's largest taxi company, owns no vehicles. The company's business model, using technology to connect drivers and customers, has attracted billions of dollars of venture capital. But for thousands of taxi drivers whose livelihoods are under threat, it's a burning issue.
There's no more negotiation possible. It's over. We've suffered for the past 3-4 years. We've had enough. We're tired.
Protests against the ride-sharing company have spread across the world. From Brazil to Budapest, taxi drivers are up in arms about the company they say is ruining their livelihoods. In Mexico, it's the Uber drivers themselves who are protesting over cuts to their pay and conditions. And the accusations against Uber continue to stack up. Its driver vetting system has come under fire after several high-profile sexual assault cases. It's been accused of ignoring court orders to suspend operations. And Uber managers have been accused of arrogance and sexism. They say the accusations are just sour grapes.
We've learned that you gotta be tough, you gotta fight for what you believe in. And if you do it, you can make the world a better place, one city at a time.
Economists say disruptive companies like Uber are good for efficiency and competition. Uber's technology leads to less waiting, cheaper fares, less traffic, and more consumer choice. Taxi drivers like Hussein Duman say they're already struggling to survive, and Uber could prove to be the death knell for their industry.
The biggest struggle we face is making a living. There is enormous economic stress on you. Second is the traffic. And third is the working conditions. Sadly, we must work under very taxing conditions in Istanbul.
Hussein is one of nearly 50,000 taxi drivers in Istanbul. So far, the city's tight regulations mean Uber has only taken around 2% of the market. But the drivers are worried that change is coming.
Uber is taking our jobs. The Uber app is a big threat to our future. We see this.
The drivers are angry, caught between increased competition and soaring licensing fees. Many have to drive more than 400 kilometers a day just to break even. In the ongoing taxi wars, the casualties among the ranks are already being felt. Protesting taxi drivers have, in the past, brought Paris to a standstill. Now Uber drivers are threatening to bring San Francisco to a standstill during this weekend's Super Bowl. To discuss the great Uber debate, I'm joined now by Steve McNamara, General Secretary of the Licensed Taxi Drivers Association in London. And in Paris is former staff reporter at the Wall Street Journal and TRT World's editor-at-large, Craig Kapitas. Thanks, gentlemen, for joining us. Steve McNamara, let me start with you. What's your problem with Uber?
I haven't got a problem with Uber. Another great myth perpetrated by Uber. The reality is that the problem we've got is with the regulator in London, who isn't regulating Uber to the same standard as every other minicab firm, the taxi industry and everybody else. The reality is that in London, Uber have pitched up, they've placed themselves between the taxi industry and the traditional private hire industry in some sort of Netherland. They run their operation from Holland. Technically, they're licensed in London, all done for tax purposes. Yeah,
Steve, Uber didn't want to appear on the show, but here's an excerpt of an email one of their representatives sent to our producer, Alexi. I'm going to quote some of it to you. He said, Uber's entry into a market has repeatedly shown that we expand the size of the entire vehicle for hire industry. In LA, quarterly gross fares have more than doubled since Uber's entrance. There are more Uber trips today than all the taxi trips taken in 2012. In London, there continues to be applicants eager to take the knowledge to become a black cab driver. Typically, this is because users would have been less likely to take taxis before anyway, whether that is for cost, availability, or convenience reasons. Do you buy any of that, Steve?
No. Well, firstly, to try and quote instances in San Francisco and elsewhere in the world and compare it with London is very, very difficult. The taxi market in London is well known worldwide. We've got the most renowned, respected and recognised as the best taxi service in the world. Black cabs in London, highly trained, the most regulated taxi service in the world. Every single cab in London has to take wheelchairs, have disability access requirements. Our fares are set by a regulator. We don't set them. And Uber have pitched themselves up and trying to flood the market with cheap and we say unsustainable labour. The knock-on effect of this is that London is suffering.
Okay. Craig Kapitas, does the case that Steve McNamara is making seem stronger to you than the case that Uber drivers are making against the regulation of their work and of their craft?
When in London, I take no cab other than a black cab. But the problem Steve has is that my children don't want to take that black cab. The problem that Steve's argument has is that the black cab industry, to a great extent, has failed to embrace disruption. And a lot of that is because, for a reason he mentioned, the government overtaxes them and overregulates them. Sadly, the black cab industry within the next few decades is going to be extinct. In fact, in December, as Steve likely knows, the Knowledge Point School, one of the most famous taxi driving schools in London, closed after 26 years because they couldn't afford to maintain their facilities. The black cab in London is a victim of England's renowned over-regulation. And Steve calls Uber's tax structure a scandal. Well, it's not a scandal. Sadly, it's completely legal and legitimate under British law.
Steve, you want to respond to any of that?
Well, yeah, I'll respond to all of that. Firstly, the Knowledge School that was closing down, secondly, never closed down. The Knowledge School was in a rather prime area of real estate in London, in Islington, and the owner of the building decided to convert it into flats, something that anyone who knows London will be very common with. They've now actually moved around the corner and they're still operating. Incidentally, the number of people taking the knowledge of London, the test that taxi drivers have to take, is actually up. Secondly, the bit about the taxi trade in London not embracing technology is yet another myth. Halo, which is a taxi hailing app identical to Uber in many ways, except that you get a black cab, was in London 2 years before Uber pitched up. So to accuse us of not adopting 21st century technology is yet another myth. The other way is looking at it as from the first.
You came in too late. You came in too late on the technology. The fact is, with SatNav and other apps, the knowledge is redundant. People like myself, take black cabs because we enjoy taking black cabs. But young people do not want to take them. As you know, London's taxis are the second most expensive in the world, so somewhere behind Hong Kong or Tokyo, depending on what study that you look at. And the amount of money, according to the statistics I've seen from organizations. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, the problem with the cost structure is you can't compare a taxi fare in some parts of the world with a taxi fare in London. A one-bedroom apartment in London is the equivalent of £700,000 or £800,000 today.
You might not be able
London
to do
is one
that,
of the
but
most
travelers do. Travelers do make that comparison. The millennials, when they travel, and they're responsible for all this disruption, they do make that comparison between the cost of a regular taxi in Tokyo and one in London and one in New York. And this is one of the reasons
I hope they also make the same.
Sadly.
Okay, Steve?
I hope they make the same comparisons between the cost of a pint of beer in London and a restaurant meal in London with many places around the world, because London is seriously just an expensive city. That's just the way it is. But to keep saying that as I said to you, we had Halo 2 years before Uber popped up. We were using satellite dispatch 15 years ago before anybody had even thought of Uber.
Your prices are higher.
Because safety in London is what we do. Well, yeah, look, if you're suggesting we all engage to a race to the bottom, the reality is, if you look on social media in London, yesterday an Uber driver, having worked 18 hours, knocked a small child over. The day before, somebody was killed in an accident where the driver fell asleep. Uber is causing major problems in London.
Okay, Steve, I want to move on and just ask Craig about this grey area, because the lines are often so blurred. I mean, my personal experience with Uber drivers has been that many of them are both taxis and Ubers at the same time, and they're sort of on the clock for Uber when they like, or here in Istanbul, they're on the clock for B-taxi when they like, and they're just a regular taxi driver at other times. How do you even find a way to distinguish the difference when the lines are so blurred, Craig?
There's a major... there's a major difference in London.
Okay, let's get Craig first, and then Steve. Craig first, and then Steve.
You cannot make that distinction in a disruptive economy. When someone is trying to disrupt an economy, the driver is going to go to where the market is, whether it's a black taxi or a big taxi in Istanbul becoming a Uber car at some point if he can make more money there. This is what disruption is all about. And the problem Steve's group has, and believe me, I'm on his side in this fight, is that he is being regulated by a hidebound government whose regulations are still based in the 19th century in many respects here.
Would you agree, Steve, that, the laws were written at a time when these transactions were far more simple? It's a disrupted industry right now. It's the laws and the regulation that needs to play catch up, and then you guys might be in total agreement with each other. Do you agree with that, Steve?
I do agree with that. Let me tell you what happened. As a result of pressure, not from us, but from local councils in London, from residents, from the police, who were seriously concerned about the number of accidents, the pollution and all the problems, they pressurised Transport for London, our regulator, to review the private hire regulations. Major concern in London is many Uber drivers are not insured. But I would seriously suggest the morality of a private hire operator, in this case Uber, who use their influence to lobby parliamentarians and prime ministers to force through unsafe practices. I think it's a serious issue. One of the things in London, to be a licensed operator, or indeed a licensed taxi driver,
to paraphrase
you have to be,
money first, morals after. This is about money. It's not about morality. And if you go into this argument with morality as your chief weapon, you're going to lose it, because it's about money and influence. As long as Uber can operate a tax structure, or any company that's completely legitimate, they're going to be able to do it, and no one is going to give a fig about the morality. The front page of The Guardian might, or the editorial page of The Guardian, but no one else will, because they're making a profit. And what's hurting black taxi cab drivers is I can go out right now and buy a sat-nav, and I can become an Uber driver in London, Paris, anywhere in the world. If I wanted to do that in London, I'd have to spend 3 to 4 years, am I correct, Steve, to learn the knowledge and that's going to cost me money. Then I'm going to have to spend somewhere between 30. Well, how much does it cost?
Okay, Craig, let me get one final response from Steve because we are out of time. Steve, 30 seconds, please.
The bottom line is that this $40 billion company that controls regulators in London doesn't pay any tax. It's wrong that it's happening. We're currently negotiating with various... I've got a meeting at Downing Street next week. I think morality counts. I think in the city I live in, I don't want this sort of thing going on. I don't want the air quality, I don't want my ability to move about disrupted by an American outsider who's only interested in taking money and doesn't give a fig about public safety.
Okay, I'll let that be the final word. Steve McNamara, good luck with your meeting at Downing Street. Craig Kupitas, even if you buy a sat-nav, I'm not going to use you as my Uber driver. Don't take it personally. Steve McNamara and Craig Kupitas, thank you very much. Still to come on the Newsmakers, Australia's asylum policy is declared legal, but is it ethical? And in Picture This, is Haiti heading for a political vacuum? An Australian court ruling that paves the way for the deportation of more than 250 asylum seekers to an offshore immigration camp has been criticised by the United Nations. Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull has defended the move, saying a line has to be drawn somewhere. The Newsmakers' Yvette McCullough has this report.
By a 6-to-1 majority, the High Court rejected a challenge to Australia's offshore detention arrangements.
I've spoken with the mother at the heart of this case. The first thing she did was break down into tears.
What we're wrestling with as a nation is not a legal question, it's a moral question.
Australia's High Court has ruled the detaining of refugees offshore is legal. 267 asylum seekers, including 33 babies born in Australia, now face being deported. Sent back to detention centres described as inadequate, dangerous and traumatising.
Women and children who have been assaulted, to return those people into conditions under which that trauma and that suffering will continue.
Around 500 asylum seekers are currently detained on the tiny Pacific island of Nauru. Most sailed from Indonesia. Every year, hundreds die, making the dangerous journey. Australia also sends asylum seekers to Manus Island in Papua New Guinea and its own territory, Christmas Island. But Australia's Prime Minister says the government's policy of deterrence saves lives.
The people smugglers will not prevail over our sovereignty. Our borders are secure. The line has to be drawn somewhere, and it is drawn at our border.
Australia has been battling the arrival of asylum seekers for more than a decade. And as time goes on, its policies keep getting tougher. Between 2012 and 2013, some 300 boats arrived illegally. In 2014, only one boat reached Australian shores. The government's tougher measures include allowing military vessels to tow boats back to Indonesia. Australia also has deals with Cambodia and Papua New Guinea to resettle refugees. But the secrecy around Nauru is one of the biggest concerns. It is illegal for detention centre employees to disclose information to the media, and journalists and rights groups are rarely granted visas to visit the island.
It is fundamentally wrong to condemn these people to a life in limbo on a tiny island. The stroke of a pen is all that it would take our Prime Minister or our Immigration Minister to do the decent thing and let these families stay.
But the government says its policies have restored the integrity of Australia's borders. And despite international outcry, polls show this tough stance to stop the boats appears to have broad support from the Australian public. Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, the Australian government says the new measures are legally and constitutionally valid, but are they ethical? Well, joining me now to discuss the issue is Anthony Lowenstein, an Australian writer and journalist. Anthony, the government and the official opposition both support this. The High Court, as we mentioned, said this is legal and constitutional. With all of that in mind, this policy is here to stay, isn't it?
It is, and one of the sad and disturbing things about Australia's policy is it's basically had a lot of public support for many, many years. Your introduction talked about refugees being a hot topic in Australia for 10 years. It's really been, in some ways, for more than that, at least 20 years, where Australia has had an incredibly harsh, brutal campaign of not just housing refugees in remote places, but also demonising them. And of course, 9/11 happens, and that also made that argument much easier. So one of the things I think that we should not forget, and I've spent a lot of time researching this issue, spent time in some of these camps, speaking to refugees and others, is that the conditions in these places is aimed to make life as difficult as possible, a so-called deterrence. The problem is that on Nauru or Manus Island, or for example Christmas Island, which is an Australian territory 3 hours from the Australian mainland, abuses are common.
Okay, let me put it to you this way then. Would you support government policy of sending them to Nauru or Christmas Island or elsewhere if they could find a coordinated way to improve the conditions for these asylum seekers on those islands?
Look, I personally wouldn't, and there's no doubt, and I hate to say this, that certainly a lot of Australians do support the idea of putting refugees out of sight and out of mind. The problem is that, as we've seen in a lot of other parts around the world, that Australia is not just copying US, UK and elsewhere, but also inspiring sort of offshore secretive detention centres, that all these camps, by definition, are incredibly bad for human rights. And I don't say that as simply an opinion. I'm saying the United Nations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, a range of human rights groups have condemned these camps for years, not just because of the secrecy, but the fact that you have, for example, some children who might be sent back from the Australian mainland to Nauru at any moment have serious allegations of being raped while on Nauru. So they're going to be potentially sent back to be around their alleged rapists. That to me is, by definition, problematic, to put it mildly.
Yeah, now, despite that rebuke from the UN Commissioner for Human Rights, despite the churches speaking out and many people, yourself and others, pushing back against the government says they're discouraging smugglers, and to the point of human rights, they're actually saving lives. They say the current policy mitigates the risks of those boats sinking and hundreds dying. Don't you agree maybe they have a point there?
There's no doubt that with the last government, the Labor government, there's two major parties in Australia, the Liberal Party and the Labor Party. They both essentially agree on refugee policy. A lot of people drowned coming from Indonesia to Australia, which was an absolute travesty and outrage. If Australia was serious about stopping that, they could strike a deal with, say, Indonesia to process refugees in Indonesia before they could come safely to Australia. The idea somehow that Australia needs to lock people up indefinitely. Let's not forget, children, men and women are being locked up indefinitely, which is High Court decision in Australia is essentially codified in situations where rape, murder and torture is happening. Again, that's not my opinion, that's the stated fact of many human rights groups.
Anthony Lowenstein, always a pleasure having you on the program. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks.
In today's Picture This, after months of instability, Haiti is now in the midst of a political crisis as President Michel Martelly's term comes to an end with no one in place to succeed him. The runoff election to choose his successor was cancelled amid violent protests, leaving Haiti facing a potential political vacuum. Let's take a look. Today's newsmaker has been the ride-hailing app Uber. Some consider it a life changer, improving the consumer's quality of life. Others see it as a life changer with the potential to destroy livelihoods. But is Uber's success based on fair play? Or is it winning a competitive advantage over traditional taxis because it's breaking regulatory rules and laws? Or is it simply a new, highly effective form of disruptive technology that underscores the inefficiency of the traditional market? Whatever the case, seismic shifts are on the horizon as apps continue to revolutionize business and drive the economy. One thing's for sure, the great Uber debate is by no means over. In fact, it's only just beginning. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. As always, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.